Welcome to Beehive Banter with both Brent Edwards and I allowed out after either trying to catch COVID or, in fact, having it fun times. Speaking of which, fun times continue for the PM as she slowly made her way back home, and you can't deny the success of her tour. An FTA with Europe and possible sanity over the 501 deportees and a possible Anzac Day present for Kiwis living in Australia. But let's start at home first, with another announcement from Dr. David Clark designed to try and get prices down at the supermarket. This time there's going to be a new industry watchdog, or the Grocery Commission, with a new and first commissioner to be appointed next year. Well, firstly, Brent, is that actually enough time for prices to come down before the election next year? Because if not, why not appoint someone now?
Look, probably not. I mean, and the problem the government has around the impact of inflation is that the initiatives it's taking on supermarkets may help suppress price rises potentially, but they'll still keep on going up. So no one's going to notice that, oh, gee, prices have fallen, I don't think. But remember, the reason the government started this whole process not because of the cost of living crisis. It started before the cost of living crisis hit, but the cost of living crisis has given it greater impetus, and it's probably now doing more in terms of putting in place this commissioner and a code of conduct and the like than it would have done otherwise, because the Commerce Commission's report and recommendations itself were fairly limited, and the government seems to be picking it up and going further.
I tell you why I think the government's picking it up, because at least they can turn around and say, oh, look what we've done. We are doing something about the prices, regardless of whether they're doing anything about the prices. It's all about the looks.
Well, it is about the looks, no doubt about that, but there is some substance to this, and you can see it is already having an impact on the way the two big supermarket chains are conducting themselves. So, I think there is some substance to it, but the problem for the government is politically is by the time of the next election, prices will still have gone up. It may have taken a sort of top off them, if you like, but I'm not sure that the government will probably get a lot of political sort of credit, because with inflation running as high as it is, you have to wait for those other inflationary pressures to disappear before you can actually start to see price rises starting to really flatten off.
Yeah, I mean, here's the problem, is that you and I and most people are we expected to believe this is going to happen when we go shopping some of us every day, some of us every week, and the bills are getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, well, that's right. And as I say, but the government, there's a whole lot of other issues at play. I mean, obviously there'll be a political argument. The opposition argues that government spending is a big factor in inflation. The government points to the impact of the war in Ukraine, supply chain issues and the like, that are international pressures on inflation, which are undoubtedly there, but there are some domestic pressures too. This is helping deal with, I guess, one of those domestic pressures, but yeah, it's probably not going to have the impact where people will see it by the time of the next election and think, oh yeah, well done government, you actually helped combat inflation.
Right, so what you're saying is it's all about the optics.
What will be more important with inflation, Grant, is again the Reserve Bank this week putting up interest rates, but of course that will help and dampen demand, but those people with mortgages are going to feel it in the hip pocket even worse.
Well, will they? Because the banks have already started reducing some of the mortgages, because now no one's buying houses and the banks need to have customers.
Well, they're offering some incentives, but people are still paying more in interest rates than they were 6 months ago. So, you'll still have a number of households, I think, struggling. They might, if they see the price at the grocery store, at the supermarket start to flatten out, if they do see that, it probably isn't going to make them feel that much better that there's a hell of a lot more money going out of the pocket to pay the mortgage.
Right, so from buying goods to those supplying them, and farmers unhappy with the government, although, well, actually, are they happy? Well, here's why. New advice from the Climate Commission, or the Climate Change Commission, assessing readiness in the agricultural sector for an emissions pricing system. Now, they've recommended to the government that it adopt the He Waka Eke Noa plan for pricing on-farm emissions, but with some notable changes. And the one that annoyed the farmers, well, the Commission's recommendation that sequestration from on-farm vegetation is not included as part of the pricing system, which would basically provide offset for farmers. Now, what does this actually mean then, Brent?
Well, I mean, for farmers, obviously, they were hoping in terms of setting up this system that they've proposed that the vegetation on farm could be used as an offset against the emissions they were putting out. So in that sense, it probably would, I think from the Climate Change Commission's point of view, they might say it would take a little bit of pressure off farmers to actually reduce their emissions because they were offsetting by whatever vegetation they have on farm. I mean, the Climate Change Commission's argument was that it would be unfair because farmers would have this ability to use vegetation for that reason, but other New Zealanders wouldn't, therefore scrap it. So, that's been a big argument. It's been interesting. For instance, Dairy NZ and Beef and Lamb New Zealand have both come out with very strong statements telling the government, adopt what we put up as it is, or else, actually. And what the else is.
What?
Or I don't know what the else is. What will they do? Because in the end, the government has always said if they can't find a system that works, then farming, agriculture, will go into the emissions trading scheme. And no farmer wants that.
Yeah, but what about fertiliser? Farm groups just made by the advice on fertiliser
Yeah,
as well.
fertiliser. So that's going to be there. They wanted that done on farm. Commission saying do it at both either the importer or manufacturer level. And again, that comes down to, again, the same argument. Adopt what we said or all bets are off in a way. I mean, I'm not quite sure what else they can then do because, as I say, this was an opportunity for farming groups to put up their system, and then it was up to the government whether it accepted it or not. And as I say, if they don't accept it in the revised system that the Climate Change Commission has put up, well, where will farmers go? Because the government would then bring them into the ETS. But of course, the government still has to get more advice, more analysis from officials, and it won't make a decision till December. So, we'll wait and see what government ministers finally decide on.
I'll tell you what the or else is, or else we're going to put our prices up again.
Well, maybe, but really, the one thing for farmers is they're not really price setters, so I'm not sure that they'll
No, but they might become that.
Possibly.
All right. Finally, despite one reporter asking the PM what's it like essentially knowing you're more popular overseas than at home, the PM came back with what can only be described as bloody successful, Brent. And the FTA in Europe, and then not only concessions on 501 deportations that common sense will apply, and a path for New Zealanders living in Australia to citizenship. Well, there we go. Reports over the past week, Brent, over estimates that 1 million of us are considering leaving the country. And at a time of worker shortages, more money overseas, better living conditions overseas, Australia, I'm thinking, has anyone thought who the big winner here is? Because it's not people living here, is it?
Well, yeah, not really, but I bought your ticket too, by the way, Grant. You can,
Thanks. Tried it once, didn't like it, Brent.
But no, it was interesting that the trip, because it was pretty successful for the Prime Minister. But if you go back to that deal with Europe, obviously the meat farmers, the dairy farmers aren't so happy because it didn't get a massive increase at all in quota for them. A lot of credit being given to the Prime Minister. I know a number of her allies saying it was her personal relationship with Anthony Albanese which has pushed some change in terms of the relationship over 501s and the path to citizenship. But that's been an issue successive governments have been pushing for years now. I mean, the one thing you've had has been a change of government in Australia, and that new government seems to have a slightly different approach. So there was probably something a little bit fortuitous about that. Yeah, I mean, she will face big problems when she does get back home, and we know she's away to Suva this week. Because the things we've been talking about, the cost of living, it's still continuing to bite, and that big domestic issue is the one that probably is most on the minds of voters.
And also having enough people in the country, enough workers, and of course we haven't.
Although, will 1 million people leave tomorrow? That's a little unclear. I'm not sure where they're all going, but clearly...
Well, now that they can become citizens in Australia and possibly vote, a good part of them might go there.
Well, that is the interesting thing, because actually we do make it a lot easier then for New Zealanders to go to Australia. And we know as it's just across the ditch, it's an easy place to go because you're still close to home and family to pop back. But you can go across there, earn about 30% more, and in most places be able to buy a property for less than you do here. And yes, and in a way, the government therefore is going to make it even easier for them to head over there.
All right. Well,
it's an interesting dilemma.
Well, Brent, with all the PM success so far, and there was a lot of success, what grand prize can we expect from the Pacific Forum she'll be attending? In fact, she flies out later today. And bearing in mind it's already in disarray with Kiribati withdrawing from the forum, so much for the one voice everyone is after.
Yeah, I mean, I think what they'll be hoping for is just a statement that is generally got the support of the remaining members of the forum now that Kiribati has pulled out. I don't think it'll be particularly significant, I wouldn't think, because they'll have to find language that everyone can agree with. And obviously in the backdrop of all this is the ongoing presence of China and its sort of diplomacy in the region. And, to be honest, the Prime Minister and the Anthony Albanese in their joint statement made reference to that, although they didn't name China, but it was clear when they were talking about approaches to the Pacific and calling on others to take a sort of a more collaborative approach in the Pacific, who they were aiming their comments at. So I think there'll be some interesting, probably behind the doors discussions among members of the forum about the Chinese influence and how they respond to it. But I think would be surprised to see the statement be particularly strong on that issue.
Well, she's already tried to calm it down, the PM, because on China she's been saying that, they've been in the Pacific for years, and that's kind of playing things down, isn't it?
Well, yeah, well, that's true. They have been in the Pacific for years, and I guess the line you have to draw is when is their activity different to what you'd expect of any other country or group? The EU's been pretty active in the Pacific at different times. Japan has, of course, Australia and New Zealand both are. So when you look at that sort of activity and say it's going beyond the pale, and I guess the concerns with China were the pact that they were trying to pull together, which had a security aspect to it, and there was concerns about that.
I tell you, the only thing I think is going to make a difference with regard to the China and the Pacific is if Australia and New Zealand open up our wallets.
Well, yeah, although both countries have opened up their wallets quite a bit, and
More.
I think climate change is a big issue, obviously, for the Pacific Island nations, and what New Zealand is pledging hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars towards climate change mitigation and the like. So, there is money going in, but yeah, but does it become a battle of the dollar? I mean, I don't think anyone wants to get into a sort of a cash diplomacy war.
Well, that is Beehive Banter for another week, and last week was great for overseas headlines. Will that carry on this week when the PM eventually returns home to that possible second wave of COVID, the flu in full, flight EDs full, prices up? In other words, as she comes back to reality. Thank you, Brent, and thank you for watching or listening.